So the title of the slide set, does your architecture deliver real business value? I like to frame that and set a little bit of context. Anytime I speak to architectural value, I like to look and define the audience. Who is this value for? Because I think there is a challenge in many architecture practices where they're not identifying specific outcomes or stakeholders, and then it's hard to define success or measure value. And so at Mega, we've put together a very simple framework we call noisy to influential. And I want to start the presentation with this framework. Some of you who've seen my presentations before may have come across this, and that's the perspective from outside of any of the architecture practices. So it could be enterprise solution, software architecture, et cetera. And any of the stakeholders outside, they may not understand initially the purpose or the intent of that particular practice. And so they perceive it as noise. They simply don't understand. And we want to get out of that stage as fast as we can because there's no perceived value. It's sort of a confused state. And so the first target for anybody who finds himself in that state is useful. And what we're looking to do here is kind of step one of the identification of value. Who is it within the organization we can provide some benefit to that would be recognized as valuable, in this case articulated as useful? So we're going to take the work product that we put together as architects, and we're effectively going to push it out to this audience to gain visibility, to provide clarity and understanding, to support alignment. There's many different purposes for it, but we want that audience to understand the value and the use of the architecture practice. As that expands and you obtain more and more stakeholders, perhaps offering more and different services, you gain a reputation of trusted. And this is where those different stakeholders are going to come to you, the EA practice, and say, hey, can you help me with this or that problem? I'm working on a business transformation, or I have a new solution. I need some help on technical guidance or what have you. You become trusted. We call that the pull mode. And then, of course, the ideal state is that as the executives and or the organization are planning for any level of transformation, they're going in to say, you know what, we really should work with the architecture practices to better understand the implications of the different ideas and or changes we're proposing. And that's where we would call it influential. It's really, truly collaborative at that point. So as we go through the presentation, I just like to keep this in mind, that if we want to ensure that the architectural practice is valuable, it has to be valuable to a stakeholder, to an audience, or to an outcome. And we want to keep that in mind from the beginning. I do look at architecture in this presentation from the lens of enterprise architect. That's my history, that's my background, and we're going to connect it to other aspects of architecture throughout. So first, now that we understand the articulation of value, it is important within any given organization that there is a clear vision. I recently attended a conference where this story was reminded. And it goes from 1962. President Kennedy is visiting NASA, and he comes across an individual with a broom in a hallway, and he asks, what are you doing? And the individual came back, well, Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon. And what's very interesting about that, especially as it relates to today's topic, is that everyone within an organization should have a clear understanding of the purpose and the direction that the organization is going. Now, it's probably rare that there's such focused clarity that there was at that point at NASA, that everybody was singularly working on the same concept. Organizations today, of course, have many, many different aspects and perspectives to deal with. But it is important that we can keep the vision and the mission of the entity of the organization clear throughout the entirety of that organization. So another example, and I wish I could credit the individual, but it had come up in a roundtable at the event I was at, was that if I do take the strategies of today's modern organizations, they're more complex than that singular focus, and we want to get that strategic vision and message out to the entire audience. That's going to cut across different business lines or business units. It's going to cut across different roles and functions. I used hierarchy as an example, but it could be job title just as easily. And when you do so, you would like to imagine that we can take this perspective and sort of drop the strategy over it, kind of like a blanket that would encompass, and everyone would work in lockstep and understand the direction and have concrete outcomes that drive the strategy to execution smoothly. Unfortunately, as many of us know, it seldom works that way. And the analogy that was introduced at the roundtable was that more often going through the different business lines or business units, the different job titles, et cetera, has the effect of running a strategy through a crosscut shredder. So in effect, you get these little pieces that are picked up in different parts of the organization. Maybe it's partially understood up to a certain level of management, but then is broken down into certain tasks, project execution, program increments, whatever it might be, and assigned to individual at really precise, specific, action-oriented levels, where the ultimate alignment to the strategy is then lost. And this creates an element of a problem, because as we're looking to make rapid decisions and move the organization quickly while still achieving that strategic vision, if we've lost the connectedness from the task or the element that we're working on to the implication or impact it has on those business outcomes related to the organizational strategy, then we have the risk of pivoting out of alignment with the strategic vision. So we're hoping to avoid that. So for sake of conversation, I've been working on a new vision for the purpose behind the enterprise architecture practice. It's not a definition of EA, and it's not to create architecture as a deliverable, but why do architectural practices exist? What is really the value and benefit in a broad sense that can be applied? And the story or the theme I'm working with is that the job of the architecture practice is to align the enterprise execution, we could call it the operating model, to the company's strategy. And often we're doing that through architecture or design. Similarly, just for clarity's sake, we could say that it's about continuous alignment, because we have to keep in mind transformation evolution today is continuous. There's no major pauses. There's no time to sit and think. We really have to move rapidly. Now, I mentioned this as sort of an equal statement between strategy and operations. Most of the time, we're talking about designing the operations and the operating model in the direction of the strategy to achieve that transformation that the organizational vision is driving towards. There are certain cases, though, that in designing an operating model in order to achieve that strategy, you realize that there's some constraint, whether it be monetary, cost related, resource related, time related, what have you. But it may be that we aren't able to achieve the strategy in the timeline or at the level expected, in which case the architecture practice can notify the executive team and say, you know, the strategic vision may be great, but we're not yet set up. We don't have the capabilities in place today to execute on that strategy within the time boundaries established. And so it may pull the strategy back, but most of the time we're moving the operating model towards the strategy. Now, I put the caveat at the bottom of this slide. This is an umbrella statement. It doesn't mean that every architectural practice has this full ambition to go enterprise-wide aligning an operating model, but that all of the aspects of the work that they do should be intended to support that. And actually, I caught the end of the last presentation just before my own, talking about cost and the red flag perspective, that if cost is singularly the determiner of particular software-based decisions, it may be a problem. And what we're going to talk about today is in part how we can tie some of the technological and software decisions up to strategic execution to hopefully help mitigate and avoid that particular problem. So now taking the architecture review and kind of marrying it up with the software perspective for the theme of this conference, I'm going to put in place a little bit of a problem statement that has to do with the different perspectives. And it's another set of slides I borrowed from a colleague, and it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's a bit humor. So hopefully no one takes any offense to kind of the joke and the perspective. So modern software teams see themselves as kind of trendy, cutting edge. They're at the front of all of the modern changes that are going on. They're the ones that are really enabling the modern customer experience. And there's a relevant truth to this. There's a real coolness, if you will. I'm kind of a tech geek myself. And so it is pretty cool to be in that position. But not everybody sees it quite the same way they do. And so the enterprise architecture perspective of some of these software teams might be a little bit more like this. Maybe it's a group that's moving a little too fast, maybe it's a little bit clunky, and maybe they're adding risk where they need to be a little bit more careful. And of course, neither is a perfect view of each of the different roles. Now, on the flip side, of course, the architects view themselves, especially at the enterprise level, as Atlas. They're holding up all of the work. They're the support structure underpinning the entirety of the organizational operations, and everything works well because of their structural work. Again, the perspective, not truth, but that's how they see it. Whereas, how do the software individuals look at the architects as maybe the boot in this particular photo? Kind of a little bit slowing things down, getting in the way, trying to put too many constraints in place. And that can have a negative consequence on the transformations that the organizations are looking to achieve. So we do want to keep these perspectives in mind as we go through the transformations to be sure that we get everybody on the same page. So how do we do that? If we have these two groups, the software that's trying to be modern and agile, again, really genuinely enabling the modern customer experience, and then the enterprise architects, it really does seem at odds. So what can we do to make this better? Well, first, for me, it's just shift the perspective. Realize that there are strategic objectives and goals that we're trying to achieve, and that we're actually working towards the same goals. And it's when we find the synergies and clarify them that we can identify and articulate some of the value of how these different groups can work together in a modern, positive way. So I put this into a context and I use analogies. I'm a fan of analogies to articulate the point. And so in this case, I'm going to use a sport analogy. So I'm going to take that of, in this case, it looks like a soccer field. We've got a player on the field, and this represents those working on software development or architecture. They need to move fast. They need to pivot. They have specific goals that they're trying to achieve, and they should be able to achieve them. Right? It makes sense. Nothing on the graphic or the plot would be a red flag or problematic. We would expect that a particular player would move in this way, pivoting as necessary to achieve their goals. And one thing that they would not expect, although they may get pushback from the market, they may have other challenges that come from competition, they would not expect their own team, their own organization, to get in their way, to run into the field and tackle them, just to put an extreme example into the analogy. They would expect that they would have support and guidance to enable their ability to execute their goals. And that's the clarification we're going to make with the enterprise architecture view. So the enterprise architect, less focused on pure agility, although it is an implication of the work they do, more focused on adaptability, a little bit of a semantic shift, but the reason for it is that the enterprise architect in this analogy is looking across the entirety of the team, all of the different players, in effect, all of the different software initiatives, all the different products, and the orchestration between them. There are different roles between these different players. There are different needs between the different roles with the different players. And it's the architect's job to really look across and ensure all of the functions have what they need, the enablement, and that there's a clear direction, that the goals are well defined and established, the rules or the boundaries are well defined and well established, and that there's the proper coordination. Additionally, having this level of visibility and clarity, similar to a coach on a particular team, they can look across and plan for the different competition that they might face, the different market factors that may be disruptive, and keep the team winning not just one game, not just game after game, but season after season. And so it's really keeping an eye looking forward and establishing the frame of reference, patterns, best practices, success elements, the details needed for enablement. Now, I could add here too quickly, and I haven't pictured it in a slide, we may even look to the business and or the stakeholders as the general management or the owners, right? They have a different perspective in the pursuit of success in this game. And we could look at how they all need to coordinate to work together. So we could imagine the architect, again, putting together plays, which maybe represents in an architectural sense, patterns or general best practices that can be used to accelerate some of the work at the low level. So I described the software teams as the players on the field. I described the architects as the coaches, and there's different levels of coaches, right? The main coach, then there's positional coaches, etc. Am I suggesting that the architects are in charge? No. No, absolutely not. It's a very cooperative and collaborative engagement between the two roles. They each have their specialties, they each have their needs, and they need to work together in a cooperative way. And it's a big caution for me that there has been a time where architects found themselves to be, or believed themselves, maybe better stated, to be in charge. And those ended up as more academic approaches. They weren't cooperative, they weren't collaborative, and then you really don't get the value that you'd expect. So you absolutely have to recognize that this is a very balanced work between the two roles, that they can benefit and help each other. The architects providing some level of visibility onto patterns, market trends, best practices, practices, maybe some guardrails. And then, of course, the software teams looking at some of the modern trends, the emergent design and architectural elements, as well as some of the core technological pieces that the architects will need to put in play can be communicated from the software teams. So again, very, very cooperative. Another element in terms of the way in which this practice would work is that we do want to get to a level where we understand, because the architects are not in control, they are working jointly. They also need to have accountability. There needs to be skin in the game. And so if you look at the far left of this graphic, it's from an organization called Infotech, a fully centralized enterprise architecture practice, which I have seen, they end up becoming too academic, the ivory tower approach. It doesn't work. The EA practices don't have the authority, and even if they did, there still needs accountability to enabling the different business units. And in that fully centralized way, it just doesn't tend to work well. On the far right, you have the extreme decentralized view. You have sort of sub-architectural teams working with the business units, and then there's no coordination of centralizing the result. Common best practices, standardized platforms that can benefit, accelerating the way to success. It just doesn't work very well in the two-siloed approach. And so really we find in the middle, what's listed here as a balanced approach, we call it a hybrid approach, is having that centralized perspective, but still skin in the game to the specific outcomes that need to be achieved by the different business units. In this way, if a business unit, a project, a product, a program, whichever initiative type of progression you're working on, if they do encounter a challenge where your ivory tower architect might say, no, you can't do that, that democratized or balanced approach would be, you know what, that's not the best way, but here is a way in which you can achieve the outcome. Or it might be, we didn't realize the implication that you're facing in the specific development you're working on. Let's work through a solution that's enabling at the end of the day, not prohibitive. And that's why I used the police graphic previously. We do need to avoid that notion of the boot on the face or throat of the other aspects of the teams. So borrowing from SAFE, we can look at some of the perspectives, the enterprise architect, the solution architect, and the system architect, and you'll see that they define the enterprise architect as across value streams. And this is going to be one of the takeaways from today's presentation. How can we work together between the architects, especially at the enterprise level, down to the software architects and software development? And I find that value streams is one of the ways in which we can do that, because it's going to help us take that strategic vision that we're looking to help achieve, break it down into customer-centric, actionable approach, where we can then articulate elements around the business capabilities and put it into an actual roadmap for transformation. So out of a recent research note from Forrester, and they're focusing on a research theme they're calling value stream management. And in speaking to them, they'll be translating this further into a product architecture perspective with the jobs to be done style of methodology behind it. But I like this quote: business leaders see development as a black box and struggle to understand its costs and priorities. Meanwhile, development leaders are often left in the dark regarding the business cases and feature prioritization, and see growing technical debt eat away at productivity. These two problems get in the way of achieving the strategic outcomes that we started this presentation from. And so we're going to look to leverage the concept of value stream and the other elements of business architecture and its alignment to the technology architecture to help satisfy and solve this challenge. So quick illustrative example of a value stream, and I will admit it's not the best articulation of a value stream, but graphically it's one that I thought had looked nice, and so I'm going to use it here. We want to focus on a customer centricity and the different elements that add specific value to the customers throughout. And then depicted in green below each of the value stages of the value stream, what are the specific business capabilities that would be needed in order to fulfill the vision of the value stream. Now, remember, we're going to look at this in the lens of the organizational strategy. So it's one, having a customer-centric view of how we provide value to our customers. It's looking at the capabilities in a centralized way. So these are core capabilities across the entire organization, and what would need to change in those capabilities to fulfill the strategy of the organization. And so using a few method slides from Gartner's recent research note, you can see here that the value stream itself, again, customer-centric. We're going to start with the identification of the customer. We're going to move through the identification of the steps, or really the stages, each of which should provide concrete value to that customer. Then we're going to identify the business capabilities underpinning each of those stages, in effect enabling them. And we're going to use that to help us plan for the transformation to the service and operating models. So you can see in the quote at left that the value streams socialize knowledge across functional silos of how business capabilities interact to drive value to customers. And it's that across functional silos element that's important. And it cuts back to my analogy of the shredder. We're really trying to avoid the shredding of the strategy, keep the connectedness that cuts across the functional silos so that we can articulate a concrete transformation roadmap. Drilling down further, if we look within the different value stages of the value streams, we can then implement them using process perspectives or technological perspectives. This allows us to identify the applications and/or technologies, as well as the functionality needed to fulfill the vision of the value streams. We're going to then look at the information flows and data flows, and we're going to use this for opportunities to better manage and align the technologies and the integrations needed to make it real, to fulfill it in effect. So again, pulling from the middle of the quote here, the value stream management provides insight and a lens into how underlying applications information technology support the end-to-end value stream activities. So tying it back to the original analogy of the shredder, if I am working on a particular product line and we've got rapid continuous transformation going on, and all that I receive in terms of vision into the strategy is one of these pieces of paper, I'm going to be at a loss for understanding exactly where my work fits into the bigger picture. And that might require or might result in me pivoting in a direction that doesn't align to the expectations of the bigger picture. And so really using that perspective of value streams with the different capability elements will bring this to a place where we can have a productive dialogue. So I'm going to use a slide from a presentation I'd given last year that speaks to outcomes from capabilities. And so for those not overly familiar with business capabilities, they're very stable. So as I present this, it should not sound like an excessive amount of work because you're not adding and modifying your value streams and capabilities on a very frequent basis. They get identified, they get articulated, and then they're kind of measured and tracked as to how well they're functioning as it relates to the organizational strategy. Now, a capability is something introduced at a point in time, and I use this human example of the ability to walk. So at a certain toddler level, you learn to walk, you have that capability of walking, and that capability stays with you for most of your life cycle. There are certain cases where a capability may be decommissioned if an organization dramatically shifts their main mission or function, but generally speaking, capabilities last for a long and stable amount of time. But what about measuring those capabilities at different points in time? And if I use three examples, speed, stamina, and stability, if I were to measure the speed, stamina, or stability of the toddler versus the teen versus the elder, I would have different results. And so in the same way, when we have the value streams broken down into business capabilities, we can determine metrics on those capabilities that cut across functional silos and give us an indication of how well we're able to perform. But additionally, we can project measurements of those metrics into the future. So if I measure a certain speed, stamina, and stability today, for example, for myself, I've been sitting on a couch for the last 2 years during COVID. And if I wanted to run or participate in a marathon, well, I would target a change in the capabilities measurements for a future point in time. And then I could work on what it would take to make that real. What would be the technologies? In a human case, maybe it's diet, exercise, maybe it's equipment, right? And in a business case, it's going to be people, process, and technology that need to change or evolve in order to fulfill that capability metric. Now, additionally, going back to that example that was raised in the previous presentation, that cost, if it's sort of a high level element that it may raise a red flag, this is where we can start to tie in that if we invest in certain technological elements, it can support the achievement of these metrics on strategic capabilities. And I've even seen cases where there's a negotiation, which was another element discussed in the previous conversation. They actually negotiate on capabilities. Maybe different business lines have finite resources, but they can see with the value streams what cuts across those silos. And then they can say, you know what, I really need this capability, but I also need an improvement to another capability. And since two other business lines also need an improvement to that same capability, maybe we can coordinate work together, enhance that capability, which makes progress towards the strategy. And then we can continue to evolve and work on that capability that maybe uniquely benefits my business line and perhaps isn't quite as connected to the overall strategy. So it really does add value. And just to put that illustration back up again, that if I could look through the examples here, and let's say that I'm trying to enhance the customer experience as it relates to, for example, the baggage management. And that can be how easy is it for somebody to check a bag, as well as maybe at a different point or a different value stream, how easy is it to receive my bag at the end of the trip? And I could put metrics. You could put examples of how much baggage could a particular airport, if that's the organization, handle. Maybe it's specific to the throughput, so how many bags per point in time. Maybe it's even specific to how many bags per airplane per point in time, right? So we can put together ways in which we could manage, and that if we find it's underperforming and the strategy focus on enhancing that element of the value stream and or the capability itself, then we can have a dialogue and a discussion and say, what's the people, process, and technology that needs to change in order to improve the metrics on that capability so that we can fulfill the organizational strategy. So it really is an element that can strongly glue together aspects of the work that's being done, help with prioritization in a strategic lens, as well as help with that view, again, that was mentioned in the previous presentation, that we can start to illustrate the strategic value of the different software that really, really genuinely is providing the customer experience that's expected today, and in many cases is the differentiator between one organization and another. Coming back to SAFe for just a moment, if we do look through some of the ways in which they define the interaction or the role of the enterprise architect as it relates to software development and delivery, you can see in some of the green highlighted text, right? Ensure the organization can take advantage of opportunities. Recommend for development delivery based on tech stacks, etc. Apply a customer-centric mindset. Nothing in that speaks to getting in the way. And there I'm largely speaking to my enterprise architect colleagues, because there has been this notion of that ivory towered EA practice. We need to move away from that. It genuinely has to be outcome focused, supportive, and enabling. And what we've discussed so far is largely putting together a strategic vision to set business guardrails for the work that needs to be done, ideally raising the visibility of the strategic value of the software work that's being done, justifying the cost in many cases, even finding opportunity, by the way, to reduce cost on other less strategic capabilities so that maybe money can be shifted for those that are more concretely impactful. But we can also support with the enterprise architecture elements of the technological perspective of enablement for the different software and software architectures that are being worked on. So if I put the kind of adaptability, agility side by side, there is this enterprise vision with the goals articulated as strategy and a roadmap vision. We're going to enhance capabilities based on value stream outcomes that we're looking to measure and expect for the market. And we're going to break it down into different phases so that the progress is trackable, measurable, et cetera. But at the bottom level, as the agility, the software architecture and software development is working, going through different sprints, there are going to be elements of needs for enablement and or emergent design that comes out of that software architecture and development that feed upward towards the enterprise architectural vision. And this, again, is just as important to reconcile. So if I come back to the analogy of the player, there is the element of kind of the business context. You know, who are we playing? What is the ultimate goal? What are the boundaries? But then there's the enablement as well. What are the proper tools and equipment that each of the players would need in order to succeed? And do they have that? If they don't have the right sneakers or the right equipment, outfits, balls, etc., they're not going to win the game either. And so we really need to look at it from both perspectives: guardrails of the business and strategy view and technological enablement. And I'm going to really underscore this notion of enablement. And so when we look at that capability evolution and we look at what's going to be proposed by the software architects, respecting the hard work that they do, they're going to come back with certain elements that they would need in order to fulfill their architectural vision, right? And so it may be things like event stream management. It may be authentication or authorization technologies that shouldn't be reinvented for every unique software that's being produced, but really should have a common enterprise-wide architectural underpinning. And again, there are exemptions even to that, but generally speaking, that level of visibility is going to come from those software practices, from those software architectures, and it can use the enterprise architecture to help coordinate and align and come up with some general best practices. Similarly, as the software architects come up with successful software architectures, those can be reported back up to the solution or enterprise architects, where maybe patterns and generalized best practices can be defined that can accelerate future deployments and developments, where they're provided maybe in a way that, for example, has been reviewed for scalability, but also security. And that if you follow a certain template, there's an accelerated path to production and deployment because there's less concern about the scalability or security or whatever non-functional quality might be important for that particular pattern or template. So borrowing another term from SAFe, it's the architectural runway. And to highlight again to my enterprise architect colleagues, it's only a runway if you can use it. So the fact that it's in a model or that it's in discussion, of course, is not representative of the runway. It does need to be in place so that the software teams can land their projects on time. And it really, really is critical that we look at some of the things I've highlighted here. Specify only those things that are absolutely needed to be specified, just enough. So again, as I go through the presentation, I know certain elements of what I discussed may sound heavier than they really are. It's important that you keep in mind that it is about just enough. We're putting together just enough guidance, just enough visibility, just enough traceability to enable the transformations to run in the way that they need to. And we're doing this at the level of the architectural runway to be sure that we have those technological aspects that will support the deployment and the landing of the different software initiatives. So again, the purpose of the EA's role in this is about accelerating the facilitation of delivery. We are not looking to slow things down. If we can come up with commonality across different business lines, different business units, different software teams, and we can put them together as best practices, if we can put together standardized, centralized technology that's available and up and running and ready for the different development teams to utilize and leverage, if we can give them a path that says, if you go this direction with these templates, if your vision happens to fit, then it's green lights all the way. You can get to production very rapidly. And that we recognize, even if they can't follow those pathways, that it should not be a red light, but that we then work together to find productive ways forward that will guide them to where they need to be. Never is it the goal to get in the way. And again, if I use my sport analogy, you could never imagine a coach running onto the field and stopping their own player from succeeding if they're moving in the right direction towards the right goal, right? They would enable it. You would not want to see them getting in the way and blocking it. So let me put that into a little bit of an illustration. The top two layers, they could be split into enterprise architecture and solution architectures. I do see the line between the two. Maybe it's not 100% clear in certain organizations. It's a little bit higher level, and others it's a little bit lower level. So I just bucket them for the moment. But you can see that you can have kind of that slower moving element. The value streams of business capabilities are very stable. There should be a level of research from the enterprise architects on some of the emerging technologies. That doesn't mean that they would then be a dictation as to which ones should be used, but there should be a familiarity and what it would take to deploy them, architecturally speaking, if the organization does move in a direction where emerging technology becomes either required or chosen for disruptive, innovative reasons. We're going to articulate visibility into the vision and strategy, and we're going to pay attention to some of the regulatory elements, which we could even put a kind of a parenthesis, security elements as well, even if they're not fully regulatory in nature. This is going to drive some elements of intentional architecture, where we put things in place on design, by design, that are there to enable and support the fast-moving elements of the software architecture and development. Right, and so this is, again, the enablement layer. Will also track some of the technologies that are in the portfolio, ensure that the monies are being allocated in the way that makes the most sense, and we should have a clear vision. It should be fit for purpose at that point. Now, as we go through the software development cycle and the software architecture that's embedded within it, you will have these elements of reconciliation. There may be a point where something that's intended and supported by the enterprise and solution architects just won't work. Maybe the software architect is very modern and something they're working on is necessary for the different requirements of the strategy organization. Then that reconciliation has to exist. And again, from the enterprise architecture perspective, it has to be enablement. It cannot be getting in the way and blocking it. And so this goal is that as we go through these phases, there's going to be elements of emergent design that will impact that intentional architecture, the reconciliation, that ideally gets us to a continuous delivery at a very high speed. Very similar, but presented a little bit more of a cycle just to see the loop, kind of how it goes. We've got the capturing, the articulation of the value streams, the business capabilities, and the documentation or the articulation of the strategy. Again, that element is very stable. So that's not something you're doing from scratch every iteration of the cycle. Rather, you're kind of remeasuring or revalidating the measures of that stage as you come back around and seeing, is it delivering in line with the strategic expectations? And if not, revisiting the prioritization of the capability evolution needed. And then that visibility of the prioritization of the capability evolution gets pushed over in to see, okay, what does this mean? Do we have the right enabling technologies in place? Do we have the right applications supporting the right processes? What changes are required? And those can be proposed. And as we look at updates to the architecture to enable those strategic achievements of the capability evolution, we're going to determine that there's need for evolution or creation of new software. And so we're going to look to that software development cycle. We're going to go through that loop. That's where the reconciliation may come back. And again, it can't be that there's no accountability with the enterprise architects. It can't be that they're a roadblock to progress. It must be that the reconciliation is with skin in the game from the architects with an ambition to accelerate a quality deliverable. Of course, that gets then handed off to operations and a DevOps that'll be tightly integrated. Of course, DevSecOps, that will also be a security dimension to that. And then we'll iterate through that cycle. And again, just enough, and I can't state it enough, that top tier, that's not a heavy action. It's something that once established is kind of maintained and managed and remeasured, but doesn't take significant amounts of effort. So I'm going to jump into a quick conclusion. And then, of course, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. So first, the key for the value of enterprise architecture in the context of today's event in modern software architecture is to avoid the shredder effect of losing continuity and visibility at that software architecture and development level up to the actual strategy organization. To really make sure there's a connectedness, that the work that's being done strongly supports that strategic vision. And by establishing that thread, referring back again to the previous presentation as it ended, we can better justify the cost of certain elements of software, removing it as a pure overhead and articulating the strategic value that it would place. Similarly, we're going to work on managing the different paces as well as respecting the different roles. A particular analogy of the sport team, the players are important, as are the coaches. They need to work together. And that way they can fulfill success in achieving the goals that will not only result in an individual project success, but also in the organization's continued success. Just to inject a quick story here, I've seen it happen on more than one occasion where we go to an organization and their architecture team has just observed that a particular technological project, maybe it's a program increment, has thrown a party. It could be simple as an afternoon, just congratulations, or it could be literally going out to, pre-COVID anyway, a location of a restaurant or a bar to celebrate the success of this particular increment. And all the while, what was deployed had pivoted away and not achieved the strategic vision of the organization. And so a cost or time constraint, they had to cut off one of the functionality that was planned, and that particular functionality was key to strategic success. And so while they're celebrating, the executives are scratching their head saying, but where's that vision I have to achieve a market dominance? And so really it's keeping this coordination, this alignment between the different views, and just ensuring that supportive dialogue between the two perspectives. They are not at odds. Enterprise architecture and the software architect's development, the modern and agile perspectives, they can support each other in a productive and positive way. They are working towards the same targets. And with that, I thank you very much for your time. And I'll put my contact info up here. So if anyone does have any follow-on questions or comments beyond the session today, feel free to reach out to me. I'm not a salesperson, so we can have a dialogue about the values of architecture without any kind of product sales pressure. So with that, I'll hand it back, and thank you very much, everyone, for your participation today.
That was great, Daniel. Thanks. It was a good job. I really liked your sports analogy. It's never a good thing when the coach runs on the field during a game.
Right?
So, uh, but uh, I, if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to put them in the question answer box, and we'll go ahead and ask them. But I did want to ask you, there's nothing wrong with what you said about enterprise architecture, but there's also, or architects, but there's also other kinds of architects, at least from a
Many.
title perspective. And in certain sports, there is the concept of a player coach. The National Basketball Association, for example, had numerous player coaches. Do you think that business people or other people look at IT and look at architects and expect them to be player coaches so that when things go off the rails, they're able to, roll up their sleeves and start to code and fix code or things like that?
I think generally there's a maybe misunderstanding, and I wouldn't even say it's even limited to just architects. I think there's oftentimes, if there's a problem, then whoever's facing the problem will often say, help, and they're going to expect that whoever has any kind of accountability is going to do everything to resolve it. So
Mhm.
yes, to your point, I have seen that. And as certain layers, some of that's feasible. If we're in a low code, no code environment and it was a rapidly assembled solution by a business individual, maybe they can resolve it themselves. But if it's a more advanced software practice that has a modernized architecture, as per the theme of the session today, it is going to require a greater involvement, greater visibility. Ideally, I think part of the vision for my presentation today is, while impossible to prohibit it 100% of the time, we're looking to reduce the circumstance where those problems happen in the first place. And of course, that we have a traceability and accountability to who can work and help if a problem does arise.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Well, Daniel, we don't have any other questions on the field here.
Sure. Well, if any do come up from anyone, again, feel free just to send an email out and I'll be happy to get back to you.
There was one on, so what position in soccer do you play or did you play?
I played the parent who sits on the sidelines cheering my son on. That's the position I played in soccer.
All right. Well, it's a good place to see that coaches don't run on the field in soccer.
Right. Neither should the parents, but
All right. So thank you so much.
thank you.
We will go ahead and take about a 10, 15-minute break here wait for our next speaker to come on right at the top of the hour.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.